The challenge in this part of the investigation is looking at how much our queer main character's identity will impact the rest of the story. That is the key question that we are moving forward with. In case you're new here with this new series, my name is Bridget. I am a queer writer and filmmaker from Canada, and I am here to help you write queer stories. So let's go. The power in your story lies in the journey, and it's no different for queer stories. We actually adhere to the same rules in this case. We do need the journey, not just the concept, not just the main character. We cannot escape the journey. So how do we find the key pieces of information that we need to make some really emotionally impactful queer stories? We're gonna dive into that today. We've got some reports, we've got some information from our detectives, and we are diving deep into the case files. We have three different reports, 2 reports and 1 list, to be specific. We are going to be looking at the initial incident report, the autopsy report, and lastly, the next of kin list. All 3 of these have different roles to play in the investigation, so we're gonna dive deep into each one and look at what we can learn from the different files. So let's dive into the first report that we have on our desks today, the initial incident report. Now, this looks a bit like a little silly, but work with me. I've got the information. This is simply, I am transcribing the incident report for you. The incident report shows us a bird's eye view / initial look, like your first impressions of the story. This is where we get introduced to the main events of the case and really your initial concept, your initial idea. In this report, we have the lesson that your character is going to learn through the story, and we have the question that we are searching for answers for. Roll with that. Not every character has a lesson or a question throughout your story, but we were mainly talking about your main character, and they have both. They have both to deal with. They need all the answers. They need all the character growth we can possibly throw at them. And not every time does your character's lesson have to do with their identity. Often it does. So keep that in mind. In your story, your main character will encounter a lot of obstacles. This is vital. But the thing to remember is that your character will only change when they want to. And this is simply something about human behavior. We don't really want to change until it is absolutely necessary or we want to. We have to be pushed into something, or the idea of changing is far more appealing to us than the idea of staying the same. So, when it comes to the initial incident report, this is when we establish the status quo. We find out why your character went on the journey and just what made them want to change. What have they been searching for this whole time? For this, let's look at the example of Steed Bonnet from Our Flag Means Death. Now, we are going to be looking at season 1 of Our Flag Means Death. In this season, we see Steed having a lot of fun. He's being a pirate. He falls for Ed / Blackbeard, and in the initial incident report, it seems that he was having a great time. We have the trajectory of him falling in love with Ed, and then by the end of season 1, they both accept the act of grace, which has them giving up piracy. Now, this changes everything for Steed. He no longer has the fantasy, and he runs away from the possible happiness that he has with Ed at the end of the second last episode, I believe, and he goes back to his wife and kids in Australia, I'm assuming. And when he gets back, he is confronted with the fact that his absence has actually made things better for his family, and that he is not happy there. He goes back and sees his former status quo and wants to run away again. He realizes that he doesn't want to go back to the way things were. He is living out of fear, and breaking out of the fantasy is showing him what he truly values. The idea of change for Steed is not running away from a normal life. And we see that by the end of season 2, he does settle into a so-called normal life with Ed on the island. He no longer has this urge for a fantasy that no longer exists. He isn't running away from the idea of settling down. It is simply that he has found the right person to settle down with. In the case of Our Flag Means Death, the fact that Steed and Ed are 2 men doesn't really come up. It is a very queer show, and the fact that these 2 men fall in love is not really a problem. Steed doesn't really struggle with his identity in this case. His struggle is more so overcoming the fact that he can have happiness with someone he loves, and that he has found this comfort now. This does contrast a lot of queer media, as usually them being queer is the hurdle. It is not something that can be accepted by society as something that needs to be overcome, or just that homophobia is usually the main antagonist of the story. Now, for this video, we are going to have 2 questions for each report. So what are we looking for inside each report? The first question for the initial incident report is, what is the lesson your main character is learning throughout the story, and is it tied to their identity? And the second question is, what is the question your story is posing to your audience? Now, this is important in the way that you can determine how much your character's identity impacts the question. It keeps going back to identity because that's really what we're talking about here. The question impacts how much the identity is featured as well. If your question is centered around identity, then it'll be a more identity-centered story. If it doesn't, then it won't be. That's a big thing. So now, let's move on to report number 2, which is the autopsy report. Now, the autopsy report is all about low points. No surprise there, it's an autopsy. We are looking at what brought your character so low. For this one, I'm going to take the example of Elliot Walk? I don't know how to pronounce his last name. It's Elliot from the show The Magicians. And throughout Elliot's story, we have him struggling with substance abuse. We have him consuming a lot of alcohol and taking drugs, as well as, like, it's The Magicians, it's gonna be like magical drugs and all that stuff. And through this, when we meet him, he is really charming, but he's also really struggling with accepting himself. The character arc that Elliot goes through is very much around self-acceptance and taking responsibility for his own actions. The low points that we have in a story are centered around the lesson. They are setbacks around the lesson your character is learning, and so it needs to both further their progression and pull them back. So what in your story is pulling your character back from accepting themselves? Because yes, that is the main thing that a lot of queer stories deal with. It is a lot of self-acceptance. We can venture out, but when we're talking about identity, I think it's important to remember that self-acceptance is a huge thing in queer narratives. The idea of self-acceptance is huge for everyone. It is a very relatable experience. So when you're looking at the autopsy report in your story, What are the low points that your character hits, and how does it help them learn from those low points? Because we learn things from the autopsy report. We learn things from our low points. They are actually, like, we learn more from like hitting low points than we do from hitting high points usually, which is a sad truth to just the human experience. I think there was a really interesting thing that I was thinking about where there's a famous beat when it comes to the Save the Cat beat sheet, where it's the all is lost moment. And in queer stories, I think there are some interesting alternatives to this, where the all is lost moment usually is a giant dip downwards, but sometimes it can be a slight dip. There are so many different ways that we can learn about ourselves, that we can learn what works for us and what doesn't. I think an example is like going somewhere, feeling accepted, feeling that euphoria, and then going back to your status quo and realizing it doesn't work. There's that kind of all is lost moment where it's not like a total loss. It's not like the world is crumbling around you in a very physical sense. It's very internal. It's a very deep feeling of this isn't right for me anymore. It's a feeling of I need something to change. The all is lost moment is a I need things to change moment. Things need to be different moving forward. And in the case of Elliot, I think there's a really slow, gradual progression for him. I think it's really interesting to look at the progression of his character to becoming more confident in his own abilities and becoming the leader that he has to be. Sure, it was through like forced marriage, which is not ideal for sure, but it does. Becoming the High King of Fillory for Elliot is really the turning point where it forces him to take responsibility for himself and take on more responsibility than he probably should, but it does push his character so much. And this really gets him to the point later on where he realizes like how much consequence there is for his actions. And his identity is not as much of a hurdle in this case, but the autopsy report is all about the low points that he hits. And having the low points of screwing up a mission in season 1, and having all of these like relapses and losing Fillory, and having all these moments of having to reevaluate how he relates to his relationship with addiction and everything. Sure, he doesn't like fully recover by the end of the show, but you can see that there is serious progress in his recovery. I want to circle back a little bit to the all is lost moment because I think it's a really interesting point to bring up. I wrote down, with the autopsy report information, this version of the all is lost moment is less dramatic in the sense that it doesn't have dramatic falls. It is more like a rise, a plateau, and then it's like a rise, plateau, slight dip, and then rise again. That's kind of where I think a lot of interesting, the all is lost moment is like a point that I think a lot of queer stories could lean into, and something that I think the autopsy report is really interesting for. I think that diving into the differences of the low points can be the determining factor of your story. I think that it can make a queer story really stand out in the way that it handles the low points and handles the high points. It's really interesting to dive into what made your character sink lower. Is it something to do with their identity? Is it something to do with how they were brought up? Is it something to do with their coping mechanisms around that? And we all have different coping mechanisms. We all have different identities, different ways to deal with our own struggles. So diving into that and looking at what brought your character, what will bring your character lower in your story is really vital. Because the low points in your story is where your character truly finds themselves. And it's just, it's where everything changes. It's where we really discover the root of your character's identity. It's the root of their beliefs, values, and just a lot of who they are in general. For queer characters, there is the extra layer of how we are confined by society, and I think that it's really important to bring up. I think that it's really interesting to look at the low points as also just like impacts from society and things that might not be within our control. The low points aren't always active low points. There's sometimes passive low points where we're just like beaten down by society, and we have to learn what we are willing to tolerate, what we are willing to fight back against, and what we value in that sense as well. So I think it's really interesting and really vital when writing queer characters to dive into that point and how society treats them, how they will respond. So let's look at the 2 questions for the autopsy report. Question 1, what low points will show your main character's resilience and willingness to change to achieve their goal? Number 2, how does their queer identity shape the low points they're faced with? Okay, moving on, we are on our last point, the list of next of kin. Now, the next of kin list is the high points. We are looking at how the people around us see us, what information they give us, and how that impacts how our character will move through the story. Because this is also this is like societal expectations 101. Like, it's the next of kin list is all about how other people perceive your character, how they are expected to behave, and everything like that. Now, I'm going to stick with the example of Elliot from The Magicians for this. In his story, he is learning the lesson. He's learning kind of the secondary lesson, or one of his lessons is to learn the value of his own life. In one of the later seasons, he is talking to Dean Fogg, one of the mentor characters, about his outlook on a certain mission, and he gets asked, what did you expect would be the outcome for you? Like, what did you expect would happen? And Elliot responds that he expected he was going to die, and he expected that he wasn't going to make it out. So when it comes to self-perception in this case, it is for him a very low point. But when it comes to realizing his self-worth, it is a very high point. I think we need to take away the idea that a scene being sad doesn't mean it's a low point. When I talk about low points and high points, this is in regards to, is it a high point in the way that it's teaching them a lesson moving towards the overall lesson of the story, or is it a low point that's dragging them away from the realization they need to make? So when we're talking about high points, we need to reframe that in a way that this scene is going to teach your character their value. It's going to help them grow towards the lesson that this story is trying to teach them. As we talked about earlier, Elliot becomes the High King of Fillory. And this brings on a lot of responsibility, and he needs to tap into his empathy, which is something that we see a lot from Elliot, but he really has to take on a new level of responsibility that he's never had before. He was the party boy and didn't really have to deal with that. It also forces Elliot into a massive leadership role, and there is a lot riding on him. He is the only one in the whole ensemble that cannot leave Fillory, which is also pushing him into a corner, which creates conflict between him and a fair few of the characters, but mainly Margot, his best friend. This also gives him the chance to be separate from the rest of the group. Throughout the rest of the series, mainly, like, he becomes High King of Fillory, I think, in season 2. Like, the end of season 1 sees him becoming High King of Fillory. And so he has this separation from the others, which allows him to grow on his own. He is on his own for most of the rest of the show. He has Margot coming in every once in a while, but it's not very common. He is clearly on his own for a lot of the time, and it causes him to grow a lot because he is forced into this isolation and he has a lot on his shoulders. He needs to develop faster because he has people depending on him. He has a whole kingdom to deal with now. Even in a show like The Magicians, where the question changes every season, Elliot's progression becomes one of him going from someone who kind of hinders missions to becoming someone who helps find answers. He becomes an active aid instead of kind of a hindrance to the rest of the group. And this is an important point where I think we kind of lose the plot a little bit sometimes, where we forget that high points don't need their payoff to be immediate. When it comes to the list of next of kin, they will not all have information that is vital at the beginning. As we work through the case file, as we work through interviewing witnesses, and we work through all the evidence, different people's accounts, different people's opinions of the main character will become vital. They will become important as we learn more, as we move through the story. And so the more we know about how our main character is perceived, what the high points are, then we can piece together the story. We can piece together what is happening. But not all of it will come when we want it to. When we are looking at high points, we need to remember that they take time. Character progression takes time because we will not learn our lessons until we want to. Another thing to take into account is the circumstances your character is in. This is vital as it influences how your character acts. How your character behaves around their family might be different from how they behave around their friends or how they behave when they're alone. So, determining who your character is surrounded by, with the example of Elliot, we have in season 2, he's surrounded by people who depend on him, people who need his guidance to help them be prosperous in their everyday lives. In other seasons, he is trying to survive. He really is around his friends. They have a different relationship, so he behaves differently. When crafting your high points, it is important to remember that there needs to be resistance. The autopsy report, as we talked about, and the next of kin report need to work in concert. They need to bounce off each other so that your character's progression is not strictly uphill. You need some low points to bring them back down, to ground them, to give you something to strive for. Because we all have things holding us back, whether it's limiting beliefs, whether it's our backgrounds, if it's the way society sees us, there's always something holding us back, and that's what makes the journey so interesting. Now, I'm going to give you a few questions, just 2, when it comes to the list of the next of kin. And this is going to look at forming your high points. So question number 1 is, what circumstances does your main character need to be in order to change their behavior? Number 2 is, what good things show the main character what they are striving for in the story? This is a really cool one, as you can kind of give your main character a beacon where it's like, that is what I want. They can still have things pulling them back, but having that kind of North Star can really help your characters stay on track even when they're pulled back. That can mean that the setbacks are even harder because you want the resistance to feel hard. They still have that North Star. Now let's recap what we have talked about. Number 1, the initial incident report. It is important to establish the lesson of your story and the overall questions that your characters have drive through the narrative. You need to know where your character is going so that you have a visual and you have intention. Number 2, the autopsy report. The low points of your story show your character's values and what they're trying to learn. They can be connected to your character's past trauma, but are not one-trick ponies. Knowing your main character's past can deeply inform their downfalls. Looking into their identity, everything in their backstory, vital for informing the low points. And last but certainly not least is the list of the next of kin. This is the high points. And high points are clues to how your characters will learn their overall lesson of the story. And how they find answers to the story's question. This is all about how people perceive them. It's about what they are learning. It's about showing the lesson. Next week, we are going to be starting the second half of this series where we'll be diving fully into the case files. So we are going to be looking at the specific questions. We are going to be looking at building supporting characters. So stick around for all of that. Hit that subscribe button. Leave a comment down below about what you have learned from these reports, and go out there and be the prism for a brand new rainbow. I'll catch you guys later.